Welcome to episode 29 of Successful Demo. In each episode, we analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of one more newly released cards. Today is going to be the first video in which we dive into the third data pack of the Kitara cycle, Council of the Crest. Now, I haven't completely wrapped up the previous pack down the white now. That was a power pack filled with so many cards that were worth experimenting. I haven't even gotten around to doing two of the most powerful cards in the pack in Emerging Creativity and NGO Front. Hopefully I'll find the motivation and time to do them someday because they are definitely worth covering. But for now, we'll have to dive into the new cards because there's so many shiny things to unwrap. So yeah, I might revisit those at a later time. But for now, we'll be looking at the first card of the pack, which is... wow. Just wow. This card. That was my first reaction when I saw it spoiled. Corporate Grant is, in one word, wow. I had to calm myself down, let the logical, rational part of my brain take over before I could actually do a proper evaluation on it. And once the dust all settled, I had pretty mixed feelings about what I was reading. This is a criminal current that forces the corp to lose 1 credit the first time the runner installs a card each turn. It's a very simple current. A lot simpler than some of the newer ones we've got, and again, mixed feelings. I was very happy that for 3.5 years, Criminal has been begging for just one thing: a playable in-faction current. Well, they got it. Corporate Grant is here. Late is better than never. 3.5 years is the amount of time since the lunar cycle, which was when currents debuted, and yes, that was the only current that criminals have gotten in faction in the unscheduled maintenance. Barely playable. Is it even playable? No, it's not even barely playable. It's trash. So yeah, the fact that criminals now have a second current compared to, say, Anarchs who have 5 in-faction currents is honestly still quite ludicrous. But again, we can't complain, especially since this has a power level that is comparable to top currents such as Hacktivist Meeting, Employee Strike. So that's really good news for criminals, and this is why I'm very happy that we've received this card. Now, on the flip side, I think this is atrocious design, and we are going to be regretting having this card in the card pool for a long time to come. It's going to be a very long time until Kitara rotates, so yeah, we'll have to live with this horrendous design. Why do I say that? First thing you notice is that this is a very boring, generic ability. That is to say, it works in all criminal archetypes. Think back to something like Hasbioroid Engineering the Future. For those of you newer players who joined us after the game's revised core set and rotation, Engineering the Future was the old HB core set ID that gave you a credit the first time you installed a card each turn. And that immediately, and for the rest of the game's life, became the default HB ID because it just was so efficient. And you could build any deck around it because every deck needs to install cards. Same thing here. Every criminal deck needs to install cards. They need to install their breakers, their resource money, their console. Every criminal deck could use this current. So, it's not... I'm not saying it's an auto-include, but it fits in every deck. It makes sense in every deck. And that is very boring game design because leading on to point number 2 on the slides, this will become the default criminal current, which is pretty awful if you consider a card like Desperado. Again, another card from the old core set. This was the default criminal console, and for the rest of the entire game's lifetime, that was basically the only console we saw out of criminals because it was so powerful and so generic. Every single deck made runs, which Desperado rewards, you know, and because of that, no other consoles saw play in Criminal. Same thing here. I think this is going to severely limit Criminal current design. They can print another 3 Criminal currents to match Anarchs, and if they are not redonkulously powerful, I think most criminals will still go for Corporate Grant. And yeah, that leads to very boring deck building. And speaking of boring, we go on to point number 3. Again, this feeds into each other. The point number 3 is that this adds no value to gameplay. It is an uninteractive current. There are no meaningful gameplay decisions to be made, no strategic rewarding of either the corp or the runner. because it just happens automatically. The corpse slowly drains their own currents. They can't do much about it. Runners, they just install cards. That's what they've been doing all along. It doesn't encourage running, it only encourages installing. Yeah, I think I've gone on too long with this rant, but you know, I always have a pet peeve when powerful cards are printed but do not encourage the spirit of Netrunner, and I think this card clearly exhibits that. So, very mixed feelings. Criminal do need a current in faction, a powerful one at that, and we got it. But next time, I think I better be careful about what I wish for. Now, where do you play this current? Obviously, as I mentioned, because it's such a generic current, you can play it in any criminal deck. But as you can see on your screen, there is one particular obvious home for this, and it's going to be the deck that we're going to be trying out today. This current is absolutely phenomenal in Geist, especially phenomenal for various reasons. Firstly, Geist typically installs a lot of cards because most of their cards contain the trash can symbol. You know, events don't have trash can symbols, but everything else does, and everything else synergizes with Corporate Grant, so that's good. Geist also runs Street Peddler. It's a good one influence card that has a trash can on it, but Street Peddler allows you to install cards during the corpse turn as well. You can potentially trigger Corporate Grant on your opponent's turn, therefore potentially draining them of 2 credits per turn instead of 1. That is a very powerful effect, one that a lot of Geist players will abuse. Finally, Corporate Grant shores up Geist's biggest weakness outright in scarcity of resources. Geist decks tend to run a lot of resources and are very reliant on tech traders, which themselves are resources for money. Corporate Grant allows you to erase scarcity of resources, allowing you to have 3 free clicks to install 3 resources without being under the influence of scarcity. This is a very big deal because firstly, they are not forced to shoehorn, you know, underpowered currents in order to not be afraid of scarcity. And secondly, even if the corp somehow manages to win the scarcity war, they are still able to get some resources in at the regular cost because you play the current on click 1, and for your remaining 3 clicks you can do anything. The other important thing is that Corporate Grant as a current is powerful enough that it can be justified as a 3-off in Geist decks. This gives you additional reliability against scarcity decks. In the past, Geist decks tended to run no currents at all, or at most 1 copy of Interdiction. And this doesn't give you nearly enough reliability to win against scarcity corps with 3 scarcities. The game is completely different now, and Geist's major, or some might say sole weakness, has now been shored up. So I'm looking at a bunch of Geist lists, and the one that stuck out to me the most by far was Heinzel's World's Top 16 list from last year. If you all remember, I did a video with him some time back after Worlds, and we talked through what his Geist deck was like and how unconventional it was in some aspects. For the full rundown, be sure to check out that video. I'll put a link to in the top right corner of your screen. If I don't, please poke me for it. But it's basically his German Geist deck, except that I've removed 3 cards and slotted in 3 Corporate Grants instead. That's basically it. So don't need to explain the deck too much in detail since I've already done so before. Let's get straight into the game, which will be a best of 2. It will be, yeah. I'll be playing against Biz the Dad, and we are going to have runner versus corp game followed by a corp versus runner game, and this will be the first in the 2-game series. So yep, I'm excited for both games. We are going to start off with my Geist versus his Asmariak tech. So Biz the Dad is actually playing the big boys Asmari Glacier. For those of you not familiar with the list, it's basically a Glacier NBN deck running 6 agendas, all 5-3 agendas, 3 SSLs and 3 degree mills. A lot of new cards, but we won't get into that just yet. All we need to know really is that I open with a godlike opening hand. An off-campus to start off with Great Draw, followed by a Street Peddler to draw into more cards, a Tech Trader because you always want to see that card, and a Fall Guy for early money. You can't ask for a much better hand than that short of a second Tech Trader. My opponent, hence knowing that this is not going to be a good matchup for them in the late game, starts immediately building their remote on turn 2. Alright, but with 2 street peddlers, I am really forging ahead right here, installing everything on the off-campus apartment. You'll notice that I'm actually preserving my fall guy here. It's the resource between the 2 street peddlers. Even though I can pop it for money and cards, I want to save it there in case my opponent is running a cheeky best defense or some way to tag me. I need to make sure that my entire off-campus apartment doesn't simply burn down. I draw into a bunch of cards, but it's a really awkward hand where I don't see any money. It's just a bunch of draw and a bunch of assisting cards. There's even an underworld contact there, but with no link in sight whatsoever. No Maxwell James. I'm forced to rely on the sports hopper for money. For the link, for my second link to trigger underworld contacts. On my last click there, you'll notice that I actually played the corporate grant. So now, from now on, corporate grant is going to come into play. My opponent scores an echo chamber, but because this is not a scored agenda per se, it's just added to their score area, corporate grant remains active. And that's very important, because now, from now on, my opponent is going to lose a credit every turn. Sure, they're getting 2 credits from their ID every turn. All they have to do is to name resource every single time, and I'm going to give it to them. But that's fine. This corporate grant will definitely neuter things somewhat. Yeah, so one slight nuance about corporate grant. Okay, before we talk about the corporate grant, my opponent installs advance here, and I knew that wasn't an agenda. If it were, they would double advance it, so I immediately used drive-by here because I knew that was an NGO. So by doing so, I immediately deny my opponent 5 credits, and this is why I have drive-by in this deck. Heinzel, or Philip Rover, did not have it in their original deck, but that's because NGO front wasn't a thing back then. Now that it is, a drive-by is very warranted. Punish arrogant corps who think that they can play mind games on the remote when I can simply drive by those NGOs and run it if it's really an agenda. But yeah, back to the corporate grant. An interesting thing about playing it is that it only triggers off the first install you make that turn. So you either want to play it on your first click and then install your first card to get the trigger, or you play it on your last click because, you know, it's the end of your turn, you just drew it or something. What you don't want to do is to install a bunch of cards first and then realize, oh, I have a corporate grant in hand, let me just play that. Because you won't be maximizing your triggers of corporate grant, since it only works on the first card each turn, not the first card ever since playing the corporate grant. Now my spy camps here sees a degree mill on R&D, which I handily mad dash here. Unfortunately, I'm forced to pay 2 cards back into my stack, which is why I pre-installed the second off-campus apartment. I didn't need it, I just wanted it to be one of the 2 cards to be shuffled back in my deck. The second card of choice is a lot trickier. Paperclip was my initial knee-jerk reaction, but it's very expensive to reinstall, so instead I think I went for Fall Guy. Not the biggest loss, putting Fall Guy back into my deck. The only worry here really is a Rogue best defense. Because now I don't have any Fall Guys protecting my off-campus, but with so many resources off the off-campus, I was feeling kind of okay. In any case, the big boy's original Glacier deck did not have best defense, so I think I'm good here. The problem is my opponent is threatening a score on the remote. I can theoretically get through if I pump up my Ormaquah with the Dean Lister. And I think I really should at least force some Ice Reses, at least force the Ash Res, which is their defensive upgrade of choice here. So I'm going to run the remote, but not before installing the Airbag Nail here. Airbag Nail allows me to bypass Toll Booth, which is my biggest worry, because Toll Booth will most likely prevent me from getting past thanks to the 3 credit tax, which I can't really afford to pay. So I see an IP block here, thank goodness. I run second to last click, enough clicks to clear the tags, and my opponent does the Ash Trace here, and forcing me to forcing the trace to unbeatable levels. They go broke doing so, but hey, bye Ash. I think a smarter thing I could have done here was to ignore the Ash and go for the Marilyn instead, because that way they wouldn't be able to score the agenda next turn. Well, but hindsight is 2020, and my opponent scores their SSL endorsement with no credits to spare. Good for them. Now this is usually when I would fire the legwork, but here's the problem. My opponent does a very timely naming of event for Azmari Tech. If they name event here, it puts them on 2 credits. When I play the legwork, they can afford to res something like an IP block, which would be a disaster for me. I can't really pay for IP block with Paperclip, And even if I do, I won't have clicks left to clear the tag, thanks to Ormakwa being my AI breaker. So I ignore the legwork for now, and as SSL money starts kicking in, I realize that the legwork is slowly becoming a non-option, as my opponent begins their turn with 5 credits thanks to Marilyn plus SSL endorsement. So this asks Marilyn ad tech deck that gets rich very, very quickly. My corporate grant isn't really able to stop it, although I've drawn my second one, so I'm definitely still gonna play it, especially given that my opponent's so poor. But yeah, it's, you know, the ad tech deck is just very rich. So we play the corporate grant, a Dean Lister, and we legwork only to see an Archangel on HQ. Choices. I decide to bypass the Archangel with Abagnale because I was planning to levy at this point and I wanted to get extra money for the levy. I'm gonna see 3 cards, none of which are relevant, and then I hit for the levy, resetting my deck and giving me another 5 spy cameras to play with. Don't forget, at this point, I'm on 4 agenda points to my opponent's 4 points. At any point, if I see an agenda on R&D, that's game. Without a way to reshuffle the deck, my opponent is out. So I'm gonna continue installing a bunch here. And I find a Street Peddler as well. Corporate Grant has already been played, and this is where you can start abusing the fact that Corporate Grant triggers on both your opponent's turn and your turn. So my opponent takes the turn here, and they start jamming, advancing the NGO, which I knew was there because of the spy camera. Now I'm gonna spy on R&D again and see a vanilla. That's fine. And my opponent, yeah, you see they pre-res the NGO knowing that it was now immune to drive-by if it's res. But that's fine because this means that I know that that cannot be an agenda. So all is good. I'm going to analyze my Street Peddler here and realize that I can fire it on my opponent's turn, sapping yet another credit from them. But by this point, my opponent's pretty rich. Thanks to the NGO, the SSL endorsement, and a bunch of burst money, they're now on 24 credits. Wow. Well, I'm rich as well. As I spy R&D and I see an MC austerity policy, I wonder if I should contest it. I decided not to. I can always contest it when it's in the remote. Instead, I'll continue setting up and compress my clicks for a future turn by playing On the Lam. IP block is the most effective ice against me because it's the one thing that taxes me even against a Dean Lister or Makwa, which is why I need the On the Lam to avoid tags in case I want to take a mega turn. I install another Street Peddler here, and seeing if it's a good candidate for firing off on my opponent's turn to get a corporate grant trigger on my opponent's turn. Alright, so the game takes a slow turn here, and this is standard Glacier play. They play slow, and you just money up and lock the remote. I know that my opponent cannot fast advance. They have to install double advance if they want to win, or fast advance off an MC austerity policy. As long as I challenge anything with advancement counters or power counters on, I should win the game. And if my opponent refuses to advance their agendas, well, I'll just wait till Spycam shows me one. So I'm going to run the MC austerity here to make sure that my opponent doesn't get the fast advance victory, and I see a toll booth. By now, I am filthy rich and I can afford to break the toll booth even though I have an Abagnale bypass, but instead, since I ran HQ this turn, I'm able to use Maxwell James to de-res the toll booth my opponent spent 8 hard-earned credits to res. The IP block comes here, and I take the tag here knowing that I have a click remaining to clear it. Finally hit the last toll booth. This one I have to pay for. Again, that's fine. My opponent's poorer, I'm also poorer, but that works out in my favor as the MC austerity goes in the bin and I clear the tag. So once again, I'm staying well afloat of my opponent. And yeah, Glacier does suffer against a runner who has a hyper efficient rig. Ormakwa and Dean Lister is a very powerful combination that allows you to break through ice for virtually no credits. The cost of paying the Ormakwa is offset by the tech traders giving you money when you pop your Dean Lister. And yeah, the only thing I really need to worry about are the on and counter effects of Toll Booth and IP Block, but it looks like the game has come to an end as I found the degree mill on R&D. As with all non-Jinteki 5-3 agendas, this one's pretty shitty because since it's the last agenda I steal, I don't really care about which 2 cards I reshuffle into my stack. I can choose from any 2 cards I want because this 3-point agenda will put me over the top to win the game anyway. So I did some number crunching. These statistics tell a very interesting story. For a 15 turn long game, Corporate Grant drained 14 credits from my opponent, which was compensated by my opponent's identity ability, netting them 20 credits over the course of the game. These numbers are of epic proportions. Think Temujin contracts, Blue Moose, from a time not too long ago. Well, Corporate Grant this game was especially powerful because of the nature of my opponent's deck. Not only did they not have counter currents to erase my Corporate Grant, they were also playing very big agendas and scoring very few times. You know, the deck typically only scores 2 agendas to win. As such, they aren't getting that many triggers to trash my current, which results in my Corporate Grants lasting a very long time once they're played. This is why they were able to achieve such good effect throughout this entire game. And the same can be said for my opponent, who named resource most of the time with their Asmari ad tech. To be honest, while playing the game, I wasn't paying attention to ad tech triggers at all. I was just freely installing my cards, and you know, since it's JNet, my opponent automatically gains the 2 credits. I wasn't paying attention to that at all, because as guys, it was better for both of us to be rich than for the both of us to be poor. We saw what happened when we were both poor. I challenged my opponent's SSL endorsement remote. They had the Ash in the server. We were both poor. I couldn't afford the trace, so you know, I couldn't steal the agenda, and my opponent did not lose much tempo. Whereas if we were both rich, my opponent would be forced to dump a lot of credits, 10s, 20s of credits, if they wanted to defend the SSL successfully, putting them in a very awful position where I'm rich, super rich, and they're poor if they want to score the agenda. So yeah, basically my grant was kind of neutered by my opponent's ad tech, but I think that's for the better as well, because imagine how much quicker my opponent could have played if I did not have Corporate Grant up. They would be 14 credits up, which means they could spend more clicks drawing, more clicks scoring, and potentially placing the pressure on me. Now, I wouldn't, you know, jump to the conclusion and say that Corporate Grant is super powerful on Temujin's power level just yet. Again, as mentioned, this was a best case scenario for Corporate Grant, where the Corp deck was completely not tagged against Corporate Grant at all. And even then, the Corporate Grant only drains 7 credits from my opponent, a respectable amount, pretty powerful admittedly, but against a more traditional normal runner that scores lots of small agendas like 2 pointers and 1 pointers, especially with never advanced agendas like the project suite of agendas, Corporate Grant will be trashed a lot of the time. While as guys with 3 copies of Corporate Grant in your deck, you're likely able to keep the Corporate Grant going. The trouble is, every time you're forced to play a new Corporate Grant after the Corp scores an agenda, well, that's another click and credit down the drain for you. So you're losing tempo yourself. Whereas with an identity ability like EdTech or say Hasbauer Engineering the Future, these effects are baked into your identity, so meaning that they come clicklessly and are hence a lot more efficient. So I would not compare Corporate Grant directly to the power level of HB Engineering the Future, simply because as the runner you need to spend clicks and credits playing the grant. Yeah, and the other thing is, well, if I'm forced to spend more clicks and credits playing the grants, the amount of credit drain per grant is noticeably lower. It will probably be around 4 or 5 credits per Corporate Grant, I estimate, which is kind of similar to the power level of, say, Economic Warfare or Mining Accident. Fairly strong cards in their own right, but not, you know, awfully broken. I don't think Corporate Grant breaks the game, but it's fairly powerful. So yeah, the other thing to mention is that unlike cards like Economic Warfare and and Mining Accident, Corporate Grant is drip loss. It's not instant effect. It's not burst economy. It's not a burst economy hit to your opponent. This is something that corps can deal with better, because if they are forced to pay lots of credits at once, you can potentially pry open a scoring window or a window to a siege centrals. You can't really do that with Corporate Grant because it only drains credits slowly over time. You can't force them to lose 4 or 5 credits at one go. So all in all, my verdict is still that of mixed feelings. I still maintain my hate, or not not hate per se, but I do not like this card at all. The design is atrocious. That is something I stand by. It is not super powerful. It's fairly good. Don't get me wrong. I think criminal decks will want to consider playing this current, but it is not an auto-include in my opinion. Unless that we arrive in a meta where every runner deck needs currents. The biggest concern I have with this card is that we are coming dangerously close to having a critical mass of credit denial cards in the same faction. And as we all know, critical mass is what causes decks to be spiral out of degeneracy. With too many credit denial cards, we can potentially see a runner deck that can lock your opponent in an arm lock. And, if you imagine the Siphon spam days, force them to do nothing but click for credits on their turn, which is not the best kind of netrunner, shall we say. Having rotated account Siphon, I would hope that they don't fall into the same trap again, but something tells me that we are only going to see more credit denial as this cycle shakes out. So this is something I'm a bit concerned about, especially as I voiced my concern over the way in which the criminal faction was expanding some time ago with all the new exposed cards. I'm not a fan of the exposed mechanic, and the critical mass of the credit denial cards certainly does not help matters. Well, whether the game needs to be fixed, that is something we'll see in due course, but for now, enjoy your corporate grants, I guess. Thanks for watching. Happy net running. Bye.